Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a hidden world within healthcare. When a doctor, a nurse, or a patient asks a complex question about a medication, the answer doesn't just, magically appear. And it's definitely not the result of some quick internet search. Instead, it triggers this rigorous, behind-the-scenes investigation. So today, we're going to decode the meticulous detective work of clinical pharmacists and see exactly how they use a systematic process to answer clinical medication questions accurately, safely, and effectively. Let's get into it.
Here's the roadmap for our investigation today. First, the drug information challenge. Then, finding the true question. Navigating the evidence hierarchy. Evaluating and synthesizing data. The 6 C's of responding. And finally, follow-up and documentation.
Section 1. The Drug Information Challenge. More than meets the eye.
Okay, let's dive into this. Answering medication queries is a highly complex, high-stakes process. We aren't just looking up side effects here. We're actively working to prevent potentially fatal medical errors. Imagine a healthcare provider calls a pharmacist and asks, "Can amoxicillin cause muscle pain?" Seems like a really simple, straightforward question, right? Just a yes or no. But this is a classic example of a biased or restrictive query. The provider is associating a patient's current muscle pain only with the medication they started most recently. If the pharmacist simply answers no and hangs up, well, they've done the patient a massive disservice by totally ignoring the bigger picture.
And that brings us to a pretty startling reality. Get this. Up to 85% of initial questions received at drug information centers differ in a significant way from the true underlying clinical problem. So the initial question is almost never the right question. This creates an absolutely critical need for a structured, systematic approach to actually solve the real medical mystery.
Section 2. Finding the true question. The detective's first steps.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that before a pharmacist ever opens a book or a database, they have to gather vital clues. Historically, this whole process was built on a 5-step foundation introduced by Watanabe and colleagues way back in 1975. It was a really great start, classifying the request, getting background, searching, responding, and reclassifying. But as pharmacotherapy and clinical care grew incredibly complex over the next decade, this model needed a serious upgrade to handle modern demands.
Which leads us to the 1987 7-step modified systematic approach. This right here is the gold standard roadmap. It expands the entire process to ensure ultimate patient safety. For the rest of this explainer, we're going to walk through this exact framework step by step to see how clinical knowledge is actually built from the ground up.
Steps 1 through 3 are all about gathering clues. First, securing demographics. Who exactly is asking? A doctor needs a completely different level of technical detail than, say, a worried parent. Next up, obtaining background context. Who is the patient? How old are they? What's their kidney and liver function like? What are their allergies? By taking that initial flawed question about amoxicillin and applying this patient-specific background data, the pharmacist transforms it into the ultimate question. For example, could any of this specific patient's 5 current medications be contributing to the dull muscle pain they've had for 3 days? Now that is a truly actionable inquiry.
Section 3. Navigating the evidence hierarchy, the funnel of truth.
Once we've got the ultimate question, we transition to developing a search strategy to filter through the massive, honestly, overwhelming volume of medical literature out there. We approach this search top-down, kind of like a funnel. First, we have tertiary literature. These are your textbooks and databases. They summarize existing research to give you a quick, easy overview. But because they're compiled over time, they suffer from publication lag and might be slightly dated. Conversely, down at the bottom of the funnel, we have primary literature. These are your original randomized controlled trials and case reports. They're the absolute most current and detailed data available, but they require intense critical evaluation by the reader.
For the vast majority of daily clinical questions like, checking a standard dose, verifying a drug interaction, or identifying a pill, clinicians are going to start with tertiary sources. Databases like Micromedex, Lexicomp, or UpToDate are the first stops. Think of them as the highly vetted medical encyclopedias for rapid, established answers when time is literally of the essence.
But what if the drug is brand new? Or what if the use is completely off-label?
Well, that's where secondary literature comes in. Think of secondary sources like PubMed or Medline as the critical bridge. They don't contain the answers themselves. Rather, they're indexing services that point the medical detective directly to the raw primary research data when those tertiary textbooks just aren't cutting it.
Section 4. Evaluating and synthesizing data. Cracking the case. So, you found the studies, but now you actually have to make sense of them. And this brilliantly illustrates the heavy cognitive lifting of the pharmacist. It's a two-part process. First is analysis, breaking the data down. The clinician critically evaluates the individual data points, looks for hidden flaws in the study's design, and weighs the overall credibility of the authors. But they can't stop there. Then comes synthesis. This is where they take that newly appraised data and integrate it seamlessly with the specific patient's background that we gathered back in Step 2. They're literally combining the science with the patient to create a uniquely tailored clinical recommendation.
Section 5. The 6 C's of responding. Delivering the verdict. Okay, we've cracked the case, and now we arrive at Step 6, formulating the final response. A pharmacist doesn't just casually relay information. Nope, they use a highly structured professional checklist known as the 6 C's of high-performance communication. Every single response must be correct, conscientious, complete, concise, critical, and clear. Let's look a bit closer at 2 of the most vital ones.
First, to be conscientious means a truly professional response doesn't hide the truth if the data is messy. If 2 studies show conflicting results, the clinician must objectively present both viewpoints. Second, to be critical means actively highlighting the limitations of the evidence. Like, was the trial size too small? Was it only tested on a completely different demographic? Pointing this out ensures complete transparency for the medical team who has to make the final call.
And remember Step 1, securing demographics? Well, this is where it really pays off. The tone and vocabulary of the response must be tailored exactly to the requester. A response to a physician is going to use precise terminology like renal clearance, whereas a response to a patient absolutely must use clear, accessible language like kidney function. Delivering the right answer in the wrong language is, for all intents and purposes, a failed response.
Section 6. Follow-up and documentation. Closing the file.
Let's move to and see how this builds our ultimate safety net. Step 7. Follow-up is all about verifying that the recommendation was actually appropriate and accurately implemented. Did the new dose work? Did the muscle pain actually subside? It allows the clinician to measure real patient outcomes and answer any lingering questions that might have popped up after that initial response.
And of course, documenting the entire process. Who called, what their background was, exactly what references were used, and what was recommended is absolutely non-negotiable. Standard procedures like the ones shown here not only build an incredibly valuable reference library for future similar questions, but they also serve as a crucial protective measure against legal liability. Honestly, in the eyes of the law, if it isn't documented, it simply didn't happen.
So the crucial point is, why does this exhaustive 7-step process matter so much? Because the systematic approach equals rational decisions, plus reduced errors, which ultimately results in enhanced patient safety. It literally transforms guesswork into an airtight, evidence-based science. I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. Next time you pick up a prescription or ask a seemingly simple question about a medication, ask yourself, how many layers of hidden investigation, literature evaluation, and clinical synthesis went into ensuring this is the exact right, safe answer for you? The medical detectives are always working behind the scenes. Thanks for tuning into this explainer, and keep learning.